It'll go away? How did you know that? All right, so I do it, okay? And you're right, it did go away, okay? So now, let's open up this one. Okay, now I click white. Oh, sorry, I'll unclick white. Okay, now I'll click American Indian again. And now, if I click white here, what's going to happen to this check up here? It's going to stay checked? How did you know that? What's that? That's the user interface convention, right. If there's boxes, then it's all that apply, and they stay checked. And if there's circles, then they don't, okay? And you probably all knew that. Even though you didn't know you knew it, you probably all knew that, okay? So that's just a convention. And there are data collection systems. SurveyMonkey will allow you to violate that convention. And so will others. And Access will allow you to violate it too. But that's a convention that I wanted to make you aware of. Another thing which is not just a convention, but is important to understand, is this isn't one column, okay? This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns. So let's go, hold on a minute. Okay, let's go into the table view. Okay, so do you see that this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns, okay? So when you do an all that apply, you have 6 yes-no columns, okay? When you do a mutually exclusive collective exhaustive, then it's just one column with a code. All right. Okay, so that's on-screen data entry conventions. And this is just because, for people who are viewing the PowerPoint presentation, they can't go to Access the way I just did, so I have all the same slides. Okay, so now we're up to the question of how do you get your paper, if you are going to collect on paper forms, how do you get them off the forms into the computer tables? And one is to do what we talked about and take them off the form and just find, the row for that particular subject or entity, find the column for that particular field, and then enter the data directly into a table. And that's fine for some studies. Okay? And in fact, I recommend you start out by doing that to see if it works for your study, and only move beyond that if you have to. Because some studies, that's perfectly adequate. Okay? You might also find you want to have an on-screen form. And in that case, I'd recommend that you develop that in Access, because you've learned enough about Access in this class to do that. And it's easy to go from Excel into Access. You could also try scanning using OMR software. I would advise against this. But the best of all is to do what I talked about earlier, which is not to collect first onto the paper. It's better to collect first onto the screen and then print out the piece of paper, like we talked about a few minutes ago. And one of the reasons to collect on the screen is that it eliminates that transcription step, which is a source of error. The second thing is that the screen can give you feedback. April 31st isn't a valid date. X is not a valid sex. This code is out of range. This weight is out of range, whatever. And you get that back right away, and while the patient is still in front of you. Okay. So that's another advantage to doing things on the computer first. You can also you don't get into the you can access the same data collection form more easily if it's stored on a server someplace in a computer than if it is a piece of paper. If you're doing data entry from both Africa and the United States, the person in Africa, well, we'll talk more about this in next week when Janet Turin comes and talks. They might not have internet access, but if they do have network access, then they can get to the same record in Africa that you can get to here in San Francisco. When you do on-screen stuff, That's called EDC, or electronic data capture, which I think is a misnomer, because I think of electronic data capture as you've got that blood pressure cuff going up, and it measures the blood pressure, and then it electronically stores that in a database someplace. I consider that electronic data capture. But in fact, in the world out there, you'll see EDC, or electronic data capture, meaning you sit there and fill out an on-screen form. So electronic data capture is what happens when you buy a book from Amazon, or when you fill out, or when you go to the ATM or the gas station or wherever else. That's all electronic data capture as far as they're concerned. Okay. One thing I do find useful, though, is even if you're using on-screen forms for collecting your data, I do find it useful to print out the piece of paper afterwards. I haven't gotten to the point where I still have that need for that piece of paper. It's useful to have a snapshot of what the record looked like when you first collected the data. And a lot of people put that in a binder, and then when you go in to see the patient on a subsequent visit, you've got that paper in the binder, and it's just a little easier to deal with than having to bring it up on a screen again. Okay, so that covers the sort of potpourri of topics that we were going to talk about today, and we're going to move on to web-based data collection in a second. But I want to summarize what you've learned so far. The meaning and importance of terms like normalization, primary key, and foreign key. That was lecture 1, and you basically got all the relational database theory you needed. You understand what normalization means, you know what primary key is, you know what foreign key is, and that's really all you need. Okay, you learned the difference between a flat file database, which is a single set of rows and columns, and a normalized multi-table relational database. And just because a database has multiple tables within it, if all of those tables have one record per subject, it's still a flat file, okay? It's only a true multi-table relational database when you've got one table where there's one record per subject and another table where there's one record per lab result and maybe another table where there's one record per exam, as in the case of the infant jaundice study. You learned a little bit of Microsoft Access, including how to develop a form in Microsoft Access, how to use forms in Access. You learned about querying data, generating derived fields, like the average, the field for the average score when a subject had multiple scores. You learned about exporting data for analysis in a statistical package, which is basically you write a query that gets your data the way you want it to look, and then you just cut and paste it into Stata, and then you run your t-test. You learned something about field types. And today I also mentioned blobs and why yes/no fields are true yes/no fields are limited in their usefulness. And then we talked about front end, the difference between the front end, which is your forms and data collection system, and your back end, which is your data tables. Okay. And all of you are going to use one of these 4 combinations of research database management platforms. Okay, so one is you can do paper files and some Excel spreadsheets and some direct keyboard entry into your statistical package. And that's probably what you're using right now for your study. And then you can use a desktop multi-table relational database like Access or FileMaker Pro or Paradox. You can use a client-server enterprise multi-table relational database, which somebody's going to have to build for you, or you could use a web-enabled research platform. And that's what we're going to talk about now is using the web platform. So what are the advantages of the web platform? Well, I already went through these when I was answering Maurice's question. So you know, you can get to it from anywhere, and it's available as a hosted service. And here are some of the options that you have. SurveyMonkey is sort of the poor man's vendor-hosted, web-based data collection, and I will show you SurveyMonkey in a few minutes. Question is the less poor man's version. And Medrio is one of the competitors out there to Question, and they've, in past years, presented at some classes like this. Not vendor-hosted, Velos, Lab Matrix, REDCap, and OpenClinica are both open source. Okay, but one of the things you find with these open source people is you still have to go find a vendor. It's true of